Hello, I'm Stan Grant. The lightning Taliban offensive took some by surprise. Troops armed and trained by the United States to safeguard ordinary Afghans simply left them to fend for themselves. The capital is quiet, but there are thousands of people stuck inside the airport without food and water. Many are women and children. Let's take a look at what the scene is now outside Kabul. And there you can see Kabul right now, and the bit of haze as there often is around the city there, and some quiet from this distance, at least, after those extraordinary images that we'd seen at the airport of people clamouring on the outside of planes, trying anything to try to escape the country. Let's get the latest on what's happening on the ground there now, live from Kabul. David Fox joins us, the AFP Bureau Chief for Pakistan and Afghanistan. David, just take us through the last 12 hours. What have you seen?
Well, life is slightly returning to normal, or what you might call a new normal, if you like, under the Taliban. Whether it's the sort of Taliban version 2.0 remains to be seen. But there's more traffic on the streets today. A few more shops are opening. Even the traffic police have showed up in their white caps and steering, through the notoriously bad traffic jams here. And the Taliban are actually quite light on the ground.
What about that? We saw those images of people trying to flee and that sense of panic. Is there a sense from you now that that is starting to calm, or is there still this rush to try to get out of the city?
The people at the airport, that wasn't representative of what was going on elsewhere in the capital, I would say. It was sort of panic breeding panic, and those scenes are sort of generally dissipated today. They seem to have got rid of most of the mob from outside of the gate, and the US military who are controlling the inside of the airport are still sort of baffled and confused about what to do with those inside.
David, you talked there, and we're going to discuss this a little bit later in our program with our guests, but I just wanted to get your thoughts from someone on the ground there around what this Taliban rule may look like. You used that phrase, Taliban 2.0, how this may differ from the Taliban that was in control 20 years ago.
Well, they've been talking this game, for about more than a year now, saying, not being very specific on how they meant to. Everything is always in the manner of the principle. But today, for example, my colleague in Herat, he filmed a girls' school. And this is something that would have been unthinkable in the first incarnation of the Taliban. And today there was a protest by women, a small protest, just 5 women holding up banners saying, "We want to work." And the Taliban, the fighters seemed completely perplexed about what to do with it. He eventually just left them and walked away. I think it's early days. While the eyes of the world are on them, at the moment, while the evacuation is taking place, I think they are sort of behaving surprisingly well.
David Fox joining us there from AFP, live from Kabul. Well, as the horrific images pour out of Kabul, with residents desperately fleeing the Afghan capital, we are now coming to terms with the global fallout of the return of the Taliban. Let's take a look back at the last 2 disastrous decades of this US-led invasion. The Taliban back in the presidential palace.
The Taliban regime is coming to an end.
"20 years of war only for this. The Islamist militants back in power, the president on the run. And American helicopters in the air getting their people out of the capital, Kabul. The Taliban moved with warp speed. Joe Biden's decision to pull out American troops opened the door. One by one, the regional cities fell. What looked like a battle that could take months took only days. The Afghan army no match for the Taliban, despite tens of billions of dollars funding from the US. As the militants swept the country, the army melted away. This should not be a surprise. This is how the Taliban first took power. Then the Soviet Red Army withdrew, leaving a power vacuum and a civil war. The Taliban emerged from the madrasas, Islamic schools, mainly in Pakistan. Supported by Pakistan, armed and funded from abroad, the militants swept all others aside. By the mid-90s, the Taliban was in power. First greeted by many as saviours, bringing peace and order, driving out brutal warlords. Then the Taliban imposed its own harsh rule. Public executions, women locked behind doors, and girls banned from school. It was a pariah government, recognised by only a few states. Afghanistan was a haven for Islamist militants. The Taliban sheltered Osama bin Laden and his Al-Qaeda group as bin Laden plotted the 9/11 terror attacks. America put the Taliban on warning, but it refused to surrender bin Laden. The US and allies, Australia included, invaded and the Taliban was ousted. Bin Laden was tracked down to Pakistan and killed, but the Taliban never went away. They dragged America into a war without end. Now the American flag has been lowered, the Taliban is back. Afghanistan is in the grip of a humanitarian disaster. Hundreds of thousands of people displaced and record civilian casualties. It is as the Taliban always said it would be. 20 years of war could not defeat them. As it always said, you have watchers, we have time. We want to discuss this further now with our panel discussing the fall of Afghanistan. Professor Armin Saikal, international security expert, Lydia Khalil, and the CEO of the Australian Muslim Women's Centre for Human Rights, Diana Syed. It's nice to have all of you with us, albeit with quite dramatic and tragic scenes playing out in Afghanistan. And on that note, Diana, I wanted to go to you as someone with deep connections there for a personal observation about how you felt watching this unfold in the past few days.
Stan, I don't even have the words actually to describe the feelings and the overwhelming sentiment from community right now. All the sentiments from my parents, from my extended family, from my siblings, we have not been able to express exactly how we're feeling. It's sort of like we're so numb from watching watching the footage, from refreshing and scrolling our social media feeds for information and updates from the ground, and heartbreaking and devastation. All of us are collectively grieving yet again another sort of impasse in the Afghan conflict and watching our homeland just be completely destroyed again.
Diana, what are your concerns about what may play out here? There's been a lot of speculation about just what this Taliban rule may mean, but what are your concerns, the worst fears of what we may see? Yeah,
I mean, it's only a matter of time, then we will see exactly what the Taliban was back in 2001. The point is they make no pretense about what they're trying to install in Afghanistan. Another caliphate, an Islamic State, removing all of the rights, the human rights that have been gained for women, for other minority groups, the gains that were made for in civil society with journalists, being able to, work, and all the women, female parliamentarians, all of the gains that have been made over the last 20 years will be wiped away. And I have no doubt in my mind that women and other minority groups will be targeted straight off the bat, as we're already seeing. They're fleeing to their homes. Women are fearful to go back to work. Schools are already being closed. It's only a matter of time that we will see them exactly for who they are back, what they were in 2001.
I mean, Saikal, should we have at all been surprised here? Yes, the speed of it is one thing, but in 20 years, the Taliban has never gone away. It has maintained a strong presence. It has almost been a shadow government in parts of the country. It has fed off the failings of the civilian government. Shouldn't this have been obvious to anyone watching, particularly the US administration?
Well, as I have been observing the situation in Afghanistan over the last 20 years, or for that matter, even longer, I mean, to me, it was very clear that the Afghan government was very unpopular and very dysfunctional and very corrupt. and there was a growing gap between the state and society and the country. And Ashraf Ghani's government had become the most popular government in the modern history of Afghanistan. And therefore, the weaknesses of the government had become the strength of the Taliban. It is not very surprising in the way the Taliban have succeeded taking over the country within a few days. And in fact, in a number of provincial capitals, those places have been handed over to the Taliban by the very commanders who had been appointed by Ashraf Ghani in the last couple of years. I think while what has been unfolding in the country is absolutely shocking, but I think to some of the seasoned analysts of Afghanistan who've been observing the situation very closely, it did not really come as a major surprise.
Lydia, but what happened to all of that investment? The tens of billions of dollars that were pumped into the Afghan army. It was meant to have about 300,000 members, the Taliban around 80,000. What happened to all of that support, all of that investment over those years to simply melt away?
Well, I think as Professor Saikal already noted, there was a very high level of graft and corruption within the Afghan government, where we saw a lot of those resources that were put in kind of melt away into graft. So you had a situation where there were Afghan military forces that were ill-equipped, unpaid, sometimes not even fed. So that was certainly a factor. The other overarching factor, too, is that once the United States decided to enter into peace talks with the Taliban, they afforded a level of legitimacy to the Taliban. And so a lot of the Afghan forces, not all of whom are corrupt or incompetent, many of them who fought very valiantly with coalition partners, they saw the writing on the wall. They saw that the United States would not be there to further support them. They didn't have the cover of any air support. And the Taliban was legitimized through those negotiations in a certain sense. And so what you saw was a quick fall because of they were negotiated peaceful surrender of cities to the Taliban by Afghan forces.
Diana, it is not just, though, the failings of a civilian government. There is something more and something more enduring and durable about the Taliban. We know that it comes from the largest ethnic group, the Pashtun group, but it's been able to build alliances beyond that. It has been able to hold on to territory, to maintain armed, to overcome obstacles. What if you could try to explain for us, Diana, what is the secret to this lasting power of the Taliban and the level of its support inside the country?
Well, Stan, first of all, having to explain 40 years of Afghan history and the complexities and the nuances in a soundbite is actually impossible. So I'll start there. I would encourage everyone who's listening here tonight to go and away and really read up on the Afghan history, because what we're seeing in the narrative at the moment is really about the last 2 decades from when Australia's intervention post 9/11. This dates back before 2001, where we've had imperialist interventionists, proxy wars during the Cold War, the Russians. It's all about how the geographical location of Afghanistan can serve the interests of other states, whether it's the US, the Russians, whether it's even China and resources, whether it's Pakistan or Iran. The lives of Afghans and Afghan people themselves have always paid the highest price for whatever has ensued and have been used as pawns in this Russian roulette and game of geopolitics that has ensued since 1979. And I think it's really important to sort of not see it through that reductivist lens of even the last 2 decades. It actually extends way beyond that. And rightly so, as you mentioned, Stan. The Taliban appeared out of nowhere. It was a long-term, over decades and of years of arming them during the Mujahideen era, equipping them to, have an uprising against a regime that was put in place by the Russians during the Cold War as a puppet regime and alliances. It's a very complex history of a nation. And I just am really cautioning the narratives that are being told about Afghans and the corruption of the government or this or that, and the blame game that keeps going on in these repetitive cycles. We as Afghan people are a strong-willed, capable people. We have agency. We have a strong, rich culture and history of uprising, of organising and self-determining our lives. We don't need Western intervention forces to save us. What we need right now is for there to be a genuine commitment to human rights and minority groups who are very much at risk right now, where neighbouring countries are closing in and closing their borders. People are fleeing by the hundreds and thousands. That tangible fear that we are seeing, people don't run after flights and aeroplanes like that if they genuinely had safety in their homelands. And I just want to be really clear with people and people who are, so-called experts on Afghanistan. We have that lived experience. Us as Afghans need to be given the agency and the voices and the platforms and our experiences centered right now. And I just really want to caution all of these narratives because it's making us really upset and triggering a lot of our trauma that is very deep-seated over these decades.
Well put, and it does lead to this question, Lydia Halil, and that is what, I think we may have, Lydia's back. It may, at least this question of what now? What Taliban are we dealing with? How should the international community respond? No, I think, sorry, Deanna, I was going to go to Lydia. I think we've lost Lydia. I'll direct that question to you, Amin. Take us through what should happen now and what should we expect from the Taliban, or Taliban 2.0, as we've already heard a description this evening?
Well, the Taliban's ideology has not really changed, but it's, the tactics have certainly changed. I mean, they put out a number of statements for the international consumption. They would like to receive the international recognition, and they would like to receive foreign aid, particularly from the Western alliance. I think now the emphasis should be that any recognition of the Taliban-dominated government in Kabul should be absolutely conditioned on the Taliban forming an inclusive government, which could be representative of the very mosaic nature of the Afghan society. And also, it has to be conditioned on the Taliban observing human rights and the human decency, which has to really prevail in Afghanistan in order to address some of the very traumas that the country and the people have suffered over a long period of time. I don't think that there is a single narrative that can explain the situation of Afghanistan. But of course, when we are really asked to about specific questions and we have to respond to those questions, we have to be very limited in what we can really say in sound bites. I think what is really happening in Afghanistan is a reflection of Afghan history. Now, Afghanistan, the only period that Afghanistan enjoyed a long period of, stability and peace has been from 1930 to 1973, and perhaps to some extent after 1978, which that's when the pro-Soviet communist coup d'etat took place. And prior to that, Afghanistan was a very peaceful and secure country in the whole region. You could actually travel most of Afghanistan without any feeling security. You can go from one end to another end. You can, and the same really was true in Kabul. And Kabul.
Can I just come in here? I want to go back to Deanna and get a final comment, but I just wanted to push this question with you as well. And again, given the limited time, it's not an easy one to answer, but it has been long described as the great game, isn't it? The imperial adventures of that region. And now we have a situation again where there are multiple players. What does China do? What does Russia do? What about Pakistan? What about Iran? How do you see this in a broader sense geopolitically and the implications we're going to see in the region?
Well, I think that Beijing, Moscow, Tehran. I'm sorry, was that?
No, yes, I'm in, and then I'll quickly go to Diana.
I think the Beijing, Moscow, Tehran axis is very pleased to see the back of the Americans. And of course, they would have also liked to see the United States humiliated in the region. And this is what has precisely happened. President Biden said that so Kabul is not going to be Saigon, but it is very similar to Saigon. The way we've seen the pictures unfolding, particularly in the last few days, it makes it very clear that it hasn't really fallen too short of what happened in Saigon. My hunch at this point is that ultimately China, Russia, Iran will get together with Pakistan and determine the future of Afghanistan. And what they would like to really have is a very weak government, not to pose a threat to any of its neighbors, and particularly from the Russian perspective, it's very important that the Taliban does not have any influence in Central Asian republics and do not provide support to some of the separatist movement or the opposition groups in Central Asian republics. From the Iranians' perspective, it is very important that their interests in Afghanistan, security interests, economic interests, sectarian interests, are very much protected. And from the Chinese perspective, it is very important that the Taliban would not do anything which could possibly encourage the separatist movement among the Uyghurs in the province of Xinjiang and so on. And of course, there is a very close relationship between Islamabad and Beijing, and I think Islamabad, in that respect, will cooperate. But I think the biggest winner at the moment is definitely Pakistan, because without the Pakistan support of the Taliban would have not been able to achieve what they have up to this point.
We've lost Lydia Khalil, unfortunately. And I want to just finish on this point, Diana, because we can talk about the politics, we can talk about what Taliban rule will look like, what the international community may do. This is a human story, and it is human beings who are caught in the middle of this. There are people in Australia on visas that may end to uncertain future. There's the question of getting people out, or people who may want to seek refuge. What about Australia and its responsibilities? What would you like to see from the Australian government?
I'd like to see a lot more, Stan. Where do I even begin with our requests and our calls on the Australian government? I'm talking about Prime Minister Scott Morrison, we're talking about Minister Marise Payne, we're talking about Minister Alex Hawke. All of these ministers collectively can come together right now in this moment in history. And actually, the last few decades, the highest price has always been paid by Afghans. Dr. Amin Saikal just there outlined to you how our lives have come to be so dehumanized and of so little value when there's a larger political game being played. And our lives are the piece on the chessboard that keep being negotiated with and used and exploited. So right now, there are Afghans that need the Australian government to actually be granting a special intake of 20,000 people from Afghanistan right now can be brought out under a special humanitarian intake category, in addition to the humanitarian intakes that we're already doing and prioritising Afghans within that category. That is our first unequivocal ask of the Australian government right now. Secondly, there are Afghans that are here right now in Australia. We've got 5,100 Afghans on temporary protection visas. We're talking about tax-paying Afghans working and amongst us who have already been approved as refugees, who are living life in limbo. That is unacceptable. They need to have their temporary protection visas put permanently and permanent residency granted to them immediately. And that is something that is so simple that the government could do. In addition to humanitarian aid, in addition to all of the other levers that can be used, these are two very concrete things that the Australian government has precedence in doing, whether with the Syrians, we've done it with the Kosovars, we've done it with the East Timorese and the Vietnamese. We've done this before in history. Now we have a moral imperative. Not to mention, on top of all of that, is sitting our 20 years of the Australian government and the Australian Defence Forces involvement in the intervention. We are seeing not even 6 months has passed since the allegations of the Brereton report in November 2020, with the ADF being all the allegations of war crimes, where not one person has been held to account for the war crimes in Afghanistan by the ADF. We owe it to the Afghans, we owe it to the Afghan people, and now it is the moral imperative to act. There is no more time for talking, Stan. I have been inundated with interviews since Friday afternoon. We are in tears, we are heartbroken, we are devastated, and we are tired. We are people too, and it's time that our lives are also given the same value that everyone else's.
Diana, it's an important message, and thank you again for joining us this evening. Diana Sayed and Armin Saikal from the Australian National University. We had Lydia Halil from the Lowy Institute. Unfortunately, we lost Lydia's signal. Now, Saad Massini is the head of Tolo News, Afghanistan's 24-hour news and current affairs television network. He is currently in London and is scrambling to secure the safety of his staff on the ground. I spoke to him earlier and asked about having to negotiate with the Taliban to stay on air and how those negotiations are going, what assurances you may be looking for.
You know, they have been, let's put it, we could call it professional. They have always maintained that they would allow media to operate, and they have done so far. I don't think we don't negotiate with the Taliban. We probably communicate with them. They're pretty upfront in terms of what they want, and they're not negotiators. Even if you look at their deal with the U.S. government, February of last year, and the way they were negotiating with the Afghan side, they tend to be pretty stubborn on key points. So the thing for us is to communicate with them. But as I said to someone yesterday, that I think we'll see 3 phases of dealing with the Taliban. The first phase is right now. They're trying to take charge and they want to show the world that they're acceptable. And I think that this is going to be the best phase. They're going to have a pretty laissez-faire approach to media. The second phase is the sort of transitional phase, when they will probably have a transitional government. It's going to be inclusive. They may have certain restrictions, but it's not going to be that bad. And during the transitional phase, they're going to work out a new constitution, what the form of government would look like. And then post-transitional phase, we will have an emirate. And then we will have probably the most restrictions in that phase. So I would think that, we have 6 months basically.
Okay, let's look at that when you say you will then have an emirate. Let's talk about the concerns that you have, specifically concerns for safety, concerns for women, keeping women on air?
All of the above. It's an existential threat to our business. We are a business after all. It's a threat to our staff. And the gains we've made over the last 20 years, whether it's women's rights and freedom of expression, all these gains can be jeopardized, are in jeopardy. And we have to be very realistic and honest with ourselves.
Let's look at this speculation now about the Taliban. Will it be different this time around? Some are saying that. How do you see it?
It's difficult to tell because the Taliban, for example, even now you have the political commission and then you have the military commission. We have to see who prevails. Like any political movement, even in Australia, whether it's the Labour Party or the Conservative Party, you have different wings and different elements, and there's going to be this tug of war as to who's going to prevail, who's going to have the more dominant role. So we just have to watch as to see who within the Taliban is going to have the upper hand and what their policies will be vis-a-vis the media, women's rights, and so forth. We can only speculate. It's too early to tell.
Can we talk about the expectations of the international community and the responsibilities of the international community as well?
The international community is, right now, they're like deers in headlight. The U.S. Embassy was forced to close its embassy. I mean, they have security guards, but imagine this massive complex that they spent hundreds of millions of dollars constructing is sitting empty right now. The British were forced to abandon their embassy, which was then looted. The British embassy in Kabul was looted 2 days ago. Every foreign mission, there are the loss as to what to do. I think they're trying to figure out how they deal with the Taliban, how they engage them. And engaging the Taliban is a good thing. You know, you don't want the Afghan population to suffer. We have 35 million Afghans who are at the mercy of, effectively, of the international community. Assistance, help, anything that comes in the future will have to come through the Taliban government, or at least they have to be in agreement. So I think engaging the Taliban is a good thing. Isolating them will just only make the Afghan public suffer.
Saad Massini joining us there from London. Well, US President Joe Biden says he stands squarely behind his decision to withdraw American forces from Afghanistan, but admits the government's collapse was quicker than anticipated. He says he faced a choice between an agreement to draw down US forces or send thousands more troops back in for a third decade of war. This is what he said.
We went to Afghanistan almost 20 years ago with clear goals. Get those who attacked us on September 11th, 2001, and make sure al-Qaeda could not use Afghanistan as a base from which to attack us again. We did that. We severely degraded al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. We never gave up the hunt for Osama bin Laden, and we got him. That was a decade ago. Our mission in Afghanistan was never supposed to have been nation building. It was never supposed to be creating a unified, centralized democracy. Our only vital national interest in Afghanistan remains today what it has always been: preventing a terrorist attack on America's homeland. The truth is, this did unfold more quickly than we had anticipated. So what's happened? Afghanistan political leaders gave up and fled the country. The Afghan military collapsed, sometime without trying to fight. If anything, the developments of the past week reinforced that ending U.S. military involvement in Afghanistan now was the right decision. American troops cannot and should not be fighting in a war and dying in a war that Afghan forces are not willing to fight for themselves.
Well, to discuss the political ramifications in America, in Washington, US correspondent Greg Jennett joins us. Greg, we just heard there in that from Joe Biden that this is, if Afghans weren't going to fight, American forces weren't going to fight. He's the fourth president in this war. He said he wouldn't hand it to a fifth, but it's on him, isn't it? So how's this been received?
Yeah, the Joe Biden position, Stan, is as you describe. It's almost as if he's asking the American people to believe that the strategy has always been right. That is the one that I, Joe Biden, have been laying out now for 7 months since I've been president, but we just hit a couple of tactical hurdles in the final few days. Now, look, that is valid, I suppose, at one level, because Joe Biden is a known quantity when it comes to his attitude to this prolonged war. He has never been in favour, even as a vice president, of extending the US military presence. He came to office promising to get troops out. He reached that decision in April, and he has not wavered, even in the face of the amazing scenes that the world has witnessed with the collapse of Kabul and other provincial capitals. So that much you can give him. But if you drill into it a little bit further, the questions that Americans, yourself, Stan, and so many others are asking still really need to be answered by the Biden administration. Why did they believe and hope against all hope that this hapless Afghan National Security Force might be capable of doing the things that they charged it to do, that they funded it to do, but which demonstrably it was massively incapable of doing? And that is a pretty fundamental ask of a military outfit. It is to stand and fight for your nation. It's a misnomer. Afghan National Security Force. It wasn't national, it wasn't a force, and it didn't seem to have been too committed to the security of Afghanistan at all, as it stood by and allowed the Taliban to do as it did. So there are two stories here, aren't there, Stan? There's the consistency strategy that Joe Biden has espoused for a long while, and then all these other wrinkles. And mark my words, there'll be much more analysis and questioning of that here in the US, including at Congress for that matter.
Indeed, Greg, thank you for that. Greg Jennett there from Washington. In Australia, what has the response been from our leaders? It remains unclear when Australia will be ready to launch its rescue mission to evacuate citizens and troops from Afghanistan as scenes at Kabul airport continue to be frantic. The Prime Minister reassured Afghan nationals that there were plans in place and thanked the Afghanistan veterans for their tireless efforts in the 20-year-long conflict.
To the men and women of our ADF and Australia's veterans, I know today is a day of sadness and reflection for our Afghanistan veterans. It's a time of deep and uncomfortable questioning, and that is only right. We shouldn't hide from it. The scenes from Kabul have been absolutely heartbreaking. It's a sobering day for everyone, and particularly those who have given so much over the past 20 years, and most notably those 41 who were lost. I know the overriding concern of the veterans I've spoken to has been for us to protect those who worked alongside us in Afghanistan, that worked alongside you. 1,800 have already been brought to Australia, 430 just since April of this year, and more will come. I want you to know that we will continue to do everything we can for those who have stood with us, as we have to this day. But I want to talk openly to veterans that despite our best efforts, I know that support won't reach all that it should. On the ground, events have overtaken many efforts. We wish it were different. Today, we remember that tens of thousands of Australians and their families made extraordinary sacrifices for our mission in Afghanistan. Those who went didn't get to decide where they went or the cause that they're asked to serve. They went because they'd signed on to serve their country.
Well, Karen Middleton is a political journalist with the Saturday paper, reported from Afghanistan, has written extensively about it. Karen, we heard from Scott Morrison there talking about what Australia may be able to do for refugees and so on, but there's still this question of getting people out of Afghanistan as well. Where does this sit right now?
Well, it's a very good question, Stan. I think the government has an evacuation scheme in process. There are planes that have gone. They're going via the Al Midhad base in Dubai, but it's not clear when they can go in yet. They need to make sure that they can land safely and take off safely. And the other problem they've got is actually getting people out of the city of Kabul, because the people that they need to extract are not all at the airport. Some of them aren't even in Kabul, and I fear that those who are not in Kabul are not going to get out, like the Prime Minister was preparing us for today. But they certainly have to figure out how to get people from the city of Kabul safely to the airport. There are, as we understand it, Taliban roadblocks between the city and the airport, and they need to make sure there's some kind of safe passage. So whether that is going to be negotiated with the Taliban or some other plan, I'm not clear on, but I think there's still a few things to be nutted out yet.
And then there is a question, and we heard from Deanna Syed talking about this earlier in the program, a very impassioned plea for Afghans who are here and on temporary visas and what their fate may be. What is the Prime Minister saying about that, and what assurances may there be for their long-term future?
Well, that's another good question. This morning we heard the Foreign Minister on radio suggesting that they would all stay at this stage. I think there was a bit of concern in the Afghan community about the qualified nature of that assurance. The Prime Minister was asked about that again this afternoon. He sounded like he was being a little less temporary about it, but we still don't have a firm undertaking for permanency or for anything beyond a temporary visa status. And I know members of the Afghan community are pressing the government very strongly to make it clear what their fate is and that they won't be sent back.
Yeah. I want to go back to Greg Jennett. Greg, you were talking there before about the political ramifications of this. It wasn't that long ago that Joe Biden was saying, America is back. Don't bet against America. Well, the Taliban has probably bet against America. There are other countries out there willing to bet against America. What does this do now for America's standing in the world when it faces other challenges, most notably from China?
Well, trying to step up and fix some of the humanitarian crisis, do more perhaps than America's fair share, would be one immediate remedy available. Personal credibility becomes important here, Stan, which is why Joe Biden's admission that things unfolded faster than he had anticipated is significant. But also getting back out there himself as president and explaining forcefully to all these allies and partners that he says are so important to America under his foreign policy, prime ministers and presidents all explaining to them that this is nothing more than a temporary setback, that foreign policy is still at the centre of everything we do, and you, as leaders of our friendly nations and supporters, are vital cogs in all of this. That's the task of repair that lies ahead for Joe Biden.
And Karen, how does Australia navigate this? Because there are new political realities that emerge from this situation, and most immediately as well, opening some form of contact with the Taliban itself.
Yeah, and that's going to be a challenge too, because the government has a decision to make whether it's actually going to recognise the Taliban regime or not. There'll be a lot of pressure on it in a range of different directions. And I know Armin Cycle was talking about that before, and other countries like Russia and China and Iran that will have an interest in endorsing and supporting the Taliban regime. But it's going to be pretty distasteful to support, in an early way anyway, a regime that has such an appalling human rights record. I know they're making undertakings about that now, but there's been recent evidence that would contradict their assertions about the way they're going to conduct themselves, and the government's going to have to think carefully about how it approaches that question of recognition.
Good to talk to both of you. Karen Middleton, Greg Jennett, thank you.
Thank you.
Sharon Bowen commanded a combat surgical team during the most intense fighting in Afghanistan, but her service came at a huge personal cost, suffering post-traumatic stress disorder. Let's talk about that and the implications for people in Afghanistan as well, dealing with generations of trauma. She joins me now from Canberra. Sharon, it's really good for you to be with us, and these are hard things to talk about. And all of us who had reported from Afghanistan or spent time there, it's triggered a lot of memories and a lot of disturbing images in the last couple of days. How's it been for you?
Yeah, thank you, Stan. And may I say thank you for including the voice of Australian veterans and families in this discussion this evening. The events of the last couple of days, particularly watching the media yesterday, caused many of us, including myself and my husband who served in Afghanistan as well, to reflect on the sacrifices that we made in this conflict and to attempt to reconcile those sacrifices with the reasons that we were there, the purpose of our service in that particular operation.
You must reflect on that, and I know you must reflect as well on the very personal connection that you had in the country. I think there was a quote once you talked about literally wearing the blood of Afghan people on your hands as you treated people in the country as well. Your thoughts as well for people in Afghanistan and what they're enduring right now?
Absolutely. And listen, my heart has been with the people of Afghanistan in the last few days, because I had the great privilege, being a registered nurse in that situation, of having real human contact with the people of Afghanistan. They are an incredible, resilient group of people who have lived through unimaginable trauma for Australians to even begin to consider. And I know that myself and my team had an enormous amount of respect for the Afghan people with whom we had the privilege to come into contact and to provide care. So part of that reconciling of the purpose of service in Afghanistan also comes back to those individuals and reflecting on the difference that we were able to make in what is the greatest adversity for humanity. You know, when humans turn on one another in war, there are always civilian casualties as well as uniformed casualties, but they're all humans. And being able to make a difference in such dire circumstances is something that was incredibly rewarding, but I think most privileged for those that served alongside me.
Sharon, I remember when I was reporting there and doing stories on people suffering trauma, and it wasn't just the past 20 years, it was the war of the invasion of the Soviet Red Army, the civil war inside the country. This was compounded generation to generation to generation. What are people going to require in the country to deal with this? At the time, as I remember, there was an absolute scarcity of people even trained in dealing with trauma?
When we talk about clinical trauma and psychological trauma, yes, that would be one of my great concerns for the people of Afghanistan today, is that if we remove the non-government organisations, the aid agencies out of Afghanistan, then they lose that support. But as I said, they are an incredibly resilient people. There are very trained people within the population, and we can't dismiss that. As one of your earlier interviewees said, Afghan people are not desperate and hopeless in their plight. They are an incredible group of people who have survived incredible adversity.
Thank you again for joining us for this special look at the fall of Afghanistan.